So, um, I want you to imagine that you are trying to type out this, like, highly sensitive, incredibly urgent email on your smartphone.
Well, that sounds stressful already.
Right. But the screen is completely shattered, and the touch calibration is just totally off. Every single time your thumb hits the letter A, the phone types the letter Q.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's incredibly frustrating.
Exactly. Your muscle memory is suddenly completely useless, and the harder you try to type at your normal speed, the worse the email looks.
Because you're just reinforcing the error,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. And then, to make it worse, your boss walks into the room and tells you the email needs to go out in 5 minutes. But,
Uh-oh.
and here's the catch, you are not allowed to use a different phone. You can't use voice to text, and you definitely cannot ask anyone for help.
Wow. Okay, so you are entirely stripped of your usual safety nets.
Completely.
I mean, your physical instincts are actively betraying you at that point, and you are just trapped in this super tight feedback loop of failure.
Yes. And that exact feeling, that forced adaptation of being thrown into the deep end with a really frustrating, unfamiliar tool,
Yeah.
that is exactly what we're looking at in today's deep dive.
It's a really fascinating topic.
It really is. And we are exploring a rather unusual set of sources today. It's actually an audio debrief from a table tennis practice session.
Which sounds incredibly niche, I know.
Yeah, but we are not really here to talk about sports, like, at all. We are diving into a concept that the original recording frames as the power of reflection.
Right. What we're actually looking at is how the human brain approaches a totally unexpected physical puzzle.
Exactly. The mission here is to extract how three very different people tackle the exact same mechanical problem.
And, what their real-time, messy trial and error process reveals to us about experiential learning.
So let's set the scene from the source material. A group of players was asked to execute a standard backhand drive, just a basic move.
Right, something they've probably done a million times.
Exactly. But they were forced to use a paddle covered in this highly tricky material called long pimple rubber.
Which is quite the name.
Yeah, it is. And for anyone who doesn't obsess over paddle materials, most people play with standard smooth rubber. It's highly grippy.
Mm-hmm.
But long pimple rubber is exactly what it sounds like. It has these like elongated rubber bumps sticking out of the surface.
And the physics of those bumps, I mean, they change literally everything about the game.
How so?
Well, think of those long rubber pimples as tiny little shock absorbers. When a really fast-moving ball strikes them, the pimples physically bend backward.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, they absorb the kinetic energy of the ball rather than reflecting it back. So if you hit the ball with a standard flat forward stroke like you normally would, the ball essentially just dies on impact.
It just stops.
Right, it loses all its forward momentum and gravity just pulls it straight down into the net.
Which brings us to the core problem these players ran into. It was immediate and honestly maddening.
I can imagine.
Every single time they tried to hit a ball that was skimming low over the net, their shots just died. Over and over again, crash into the net.
Yeah, just imagine the psychological friction of that moment for them.
It must have been awful. I mean, they are executing the exact physical motion that has worked for them thousands of times before.
And suddenly, they are failing 100% of the time. The tool is just outright rejecting their established habits.
Exactly. But the coach of this group handles this beautifully. They step in, but they don't, like, play the savior.
Right. They don't just hand them the answer.
No. They don't give a tutorial or demonstrate the perfect backhand with this weird long pimple rubber. The coach simply tells them, figure out how to get the ball over the net.
Go experiment, essentially.
Yeah. Go experiment, don't discuss your methods with each other, and report back.
Which is a brilliant way to teach. By deliberately withholding the instructions, the coach forces raw, mechanical problem solving.
It totally reminds me of being handed a piece of incredibly clunky, unfamiliar software at work.
Oh, absolutely.
Like someone says, figure out how to send an invoice, but don't look at the manual and you can't ask your coworkers.
Right, because if the coach had just dictated the solution, the players would have just mimicked the motion without actually understanding the underlying physics.
Exactly. And instead, we get three distinct, entirely organic solutions to the exact same physics puzzle.
Which is what makes this such a great source to unpack.
So let's look at the first player solution, because I think it is such a relatable way to tackle a sudden roadblock.
Okay, what did they do?
Well, when the normal way of swinging didn't work, this player didn't completely reinvent their bodily movement. Instead, they just changed where the ball actually made contact with the paddle.
Ah, okay.
No.
So if you can't change the software like your physical swing,
Yeah.
you just alter the hardware interaction.
Exactly. This
Mm.
player realized that hitting the ball dead center on the paddle, which is normally the sweet spot, was actually the problem.
Because hitting the center meant the rubber absorbed all that energy.
Right. It required a massive, exhausting amount of body force just to
Mhm.
heave the ball over the net. So they moved the contact point.
Where to?
They started hitting the ball at the very top tip or the head of the paddle. And somehow that worked.
How that makes a lot of sense mechanically. They essentially turned the paddle into a more efficient lever.
Wait, really? How did that work?
Well, by moving the point of contact away from the hand and up to the furthest extreme of the paddle, they completely changed the energy transfer.
Okay, I think I'm following.
It's just basic physics, you know?
Right.
The further out on a rotating lever you make contact, the faster that point is moving relative to the pivot point.
Oh, like choking up on a baseball bat or, well, the opposite, maximizing the length of the bat.
Exactly. By hitting at the tip, they generated way more paddlehead speed with significantly less effort from their arm and core, so the ball popped over the net.
That is such a classic workplace survival tactic. It really reminds me of writing a super messy, convoluted Excel macro just to get a mandatory report out the door on a Friday at 5 p.m.
Right, it gets the job done for the day.
It does. But okay, let's unpack this.
Right.
I have to push back on the long-term viability of this.
Oh, for sure.
If hitting with the absolute tip of the paddle clears the net perfectly with less energy, why wouldn't every single player just do that all the time? There has to be a severe trade-off.
You're totally right. And the player actually discovered the trade-off as soon as the parameters of the drill changed.
What happened?
It's a great survival tactic, but it completely shatters under pressure. When the coach asked this first player what happened when they tried to hit the ball harder using that tip of the paddle hack, the whole system just broke down.
I mean, the margin for error must be razor thin.
Oh, absolutely.
When you are swinging really hard and aiming for the outermost millimeter of a paddle, you are naturally going to miscalculate.
Yeah, they admitted to accidentally hitting the middle of the paddle again, which, of course, resulted in a totally unpredictable dead shot into the net.
Right, but is that the only trade-off?
No, there is also a profound aerodynamic issue. If you just swing flat and hard and use the tip of the paddle to maximize that lever effect, you are generating entirely linear forward momentum.
So the ball just launches.
Exactly. It flies completely off the table. To compensate for that, the player realized they had to artificially add a brushing upward motion, a topspin motion, at the exact moment of impact.
Just to force the ball to arc back down onto the table.
Yes, just to keep the shot viable at higher speeds.
Wow. So their incredibly simple quick fix suddenly required a highly complex secondary correction just to keep it working.
Right. It's a perfect analogy for how we all handle unfamiliar situations.
It really is. When you face a new problem, your first instinct is a hack. You find a workaround requiring the least amount of behavioral change.
And that hack works perfectly for basic survival.
But it rarely scales. The moment you need to add power or speed or volume to a hacked process, the whole system becomes unstable. And you end up working twice as hard just to keep things from flying off the rails.
Exactly. And, you know, if the hardware hack falls apart the second you try to add power, the only alternative is to completely rewrite the software.
Which brings us to the second player.
Right. This is the exact realization the second player in the debrief had. They abandoned the hardware hack entirely.
Yeah, player 2 didn't mess around with changing the contact point to the tip of the paddle. They stuck to hitting it in the center, normally.
But they completely abandoned the standard, flat, forward striking motion.
Because the long pimple rubber acts like a shock absorber and kills the flat energy.
Right. So this player decided to hit every single shot with a heavy topspin motion.
Every single time. They used an upward brushing stroke instead of pushing forward. And according to the debrief, this gave them a 100% success rate in getting those low balls over the net.
They basically stopped trying to push the ball through the air and started trying to roll it through the air.
What really stands out to me is how this affected their ability to add power.
It was a completely different experience from the first player, right?
Totally. Unlike the first player, who lost total control when they tried to hit hard, this second player found adding power incredibly easy.
Because that topspin motion naturally grabs the ball and forces it to dive sharply downward onto the table.
Right, they had a built-in safety mechanism, so they could swing as hard as they wanted.
And how did they generate that power?
Well, to get that power, they didn't use their arm. They simply transferred weight from their hips.
Ah!
They drove the power up from their lower body through that brushing motion and right into the ball.
That's brilliant. They use the heavy, powerful muscles of the hips to generate force and the topspin geometry to control that force.
Okay, but wait. I'm stuck on the physics here. I really need to push back on this.
Okay, what's sticking?
If the rubber is practically frictionless, which is exactly why the flat shots were dying and falling into the net in the first place, how can you possibly brush it?
That is the big question.
I mean, topspin requires grip. You can't brush ice, you know. If long pimples have minimal surface area contact, a brushing motion just shouldn't work.
And that is exactly the paradox of this material. The long pimples are inherently terrible at gripping the ball compared to smooth rubber.
Right.
But by forcing an exaggerated topspin brush and then coupling that with the explosive power of the hip transfer, the player is essentially overriding the equipment's deficiency.
Like through pure brute force biomechanics.
Yes. Because the rubber won't naturally grip and arc the ball for you, you literally have to manufacture that arc entirely with your own body.
Oh, wow. So you're aggressively lifting the ball against its own momentum.
Exactly. The long pimples want the ball to drop dead. The player is using the hips and intense upward friction to physically drag the ball over the net.
That's wild.
It's not about the rubber gripping the ball perfectly anymore. It's about the body generating so much upward force that the lack of grip just ceases to matter.
They are artificially creating the physics that the paddle refuses to provide.
Precisely.
They are literally outmuscling the limitations of the tool with superior physical technique.
Which is such a powerful takeaway. Both of these players found a way to survive the drill, but in totally different ways.
Yeah. Player 1 used the tip of the paddle to change the lever and clear the net with low energy. Player 2 fundamentally changed their stroke to a hip-driven topspin to overcome the deadness of the rubber.
So how does someone who actually understands the tool make sense of all this?
Well, that is where the source material brings in the teacher, the master who is just quietly observing this whole experiment unfold.
And the teacher's reflection synthesizes all these scattered puzzle pieces into a really elegant, unified theory of the material.
They really do. The teacher details their own mechanical approach to the problem, and they essentially went back to basics, but with like surgical precision.
Right. They hit the ball in the middle of the paddle.
Exactly. And they use their elbow as a fixed pivot point. But they focused hyper-specifically on two critical variables that the students mostly missed.
What was the first one?
First, they focused on hitting the ball at a very specific timing they called P2. The source defines this as the exact moment the ball passes its peak bounce and just begins to drop.
Right, and the geometry of this timing is absolutely crucial. It goes back to why the long pimples are so unforgiving in the first place.
Can you break that down for us?
Sure. Let's visualize the trajectory arc of a bouncing ping pong ball. It hits the table, bounces upward on a rise, hits an apex, and then starts to fall back down.
Right, standard physics.
If you hit the ball on the rise, your paddle naturally wants to close over the top of the ball, driving the energy downward.
And with normal grippy rubber, the extreme friction grabs the ball and pulls it over the net anyway, right?
Exactly. But with slick, long pimples, that downward angle just drives the ball straight into the net.
Oh. So waiting for the drop changes the geometric relationship between the paddle and the ball.
Precisely. By waiting for P2, that exact moment the ball starts to descend, you are forced to hit it with an open paddle face that is traveling slightly upward to meet the falling ball.
So you are naturally creating a lifting trajectory.
Yes. Waiting for the drop maximizes the physical space and the upward angle available to clear the net.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. It forces the geometry to work in your favor. And I think that leads directly to the teacher's second critical variable.
Which was about paddle placement, right?
Yeah. They noted that you have to consciously place the paddle slightly under the ball.
Ah.
The teacher explicitly echoed what we just discussed about the lack of grip. Because the long pimples have so little friction with the ball, you cannot rely on the paddle to do the work.
Right. The tool won't help you there.
No. You have to intentionally get under it and add your own brushing force from the body to compensate for the rubber's weakness.
It's amazing. The master arrives at the fundamental truth of the material by combining the physical limitations of the paddle with the geometric reality of the bouncing ball.
But here's where it gets really interesting to me. As the teacher is explaining this unified, theoretically perfect way to hit the ball, they do something fascinating.
What's that?
They don't dismiss the students' messy hacks as being wrong.
Oh, I love that.
Instead, they look at the raw experimentation and figure out exactly why those hacks worked in context.
They validate the trial and error process.
They do. specifically with player one. The teacher looks at player one's weird hack of hitting the ball with the very tip of the paddle.
The lever trick.
Exactly. The teacher realizes that while hitting at the tip isn't ideal for generating massive power, it is an absolutely brilliant strategy for emergencies.
Oh, because in a real fast-paced game, you don't always have the luxury of perfectly waiting for the P2 drop.
Right. You don't always have time to set your feet and transfer weight from your hips like player two did.
Sometimes you are caught completely out of position. You literally have zero time to use your lower body.
And in those split-second emergencies, player one's instinct to use the tip of the paddle to maximize the lever, just to pop the ball over the net with a flick of the wrist, is actually the perfect survival move.
It really just shows that unvarnished, unguided experimentation almost always uncovers a piece of the truth, even if that truth is highly situational.
Exactly.
Oh.
All these different chaotic approaches ultimately collided into the exact same physical reality.
They did. Player 2 realized they had to use a brushing topspin motion to get power and consistency.
The teacher explicitly stated that you must place the paddle under the ball and brush upward to compensate for the rubber.
And even player 1, who tried to cheat the system with the tip of the paddle, eventually found that when they tried to hit hard, they had to add an upward brushing friction just to keep the ball from flying into the wall.
It's incredible. Whether you start by changing the contact point or you start by fundamentally changing the swing, the physical reality of the tool forces your hand.
The undeniable physics of the long pimple rubber strictly dictates the required human behavior.
Everyone, through completely entirely different paths of failure, arrived at the inescapable conclusion. To control this difficult tool at high speeds, you must use a topspin motion.
It's such a great illustration of experiential learning.
It really is. And, why does this deep dive into table tennis rubber actually matter to you, the listener?
Right, bringing it back to the real world.
Because this entire exercise in the power of reflection is a blueprint for how we process failure and how we acquire complex skills. Think about how you operate in your own life. When you are suddenly handed a clunky, unfamiliar tool, maybe a new software system at work, a new process, or a totally new way of communicating with a team, what is your default reaction?
That's the real question.
Do you stubbornly force your old habits, hitting the problem flat and straightforward, and getting frustrated every time your efforts crash into the net?
Or do you look for the quickest tip of the paddle hack just to survive the day, knowing full well it will completely break when you try to scale it?
Right. Or do you take a step back, analyze the physical limitations of the new tool, and fundamentally adapt your mechanics to master it?
The critical element here really is the vital importance of conscious reflection. Because it is rarely enough to simply fail and try again blindly. The players in this debrief didn't just hit the net and shrug.
No. They thought critically about why the ball was dropping.
Exactly. They analyzed the interaction between their body, the tool, and the environment. And that level of reflection, questioning your own assumptions and breaking down the granular mechanics of your failure, that is the only way to synthesize a completely new, permanent skill.
It is the stark difference between blindly repeating a mistake and actively engineering a solution.
And sometimes the most frustrating tools are often the ones that teach us the most about our own capabilities.
Right, yeah.
By refusing to behave the way smooth rubber behaves, the long pimples force these players to deeply understand the mechanics of topspin, lever dynamics, and weight transfer in a way they never would have if the drill had just been easy.
The friction was the curriculum.
Oh, I like that, yes.
So today we looked at how a deliberately difficult tool forced a group of players to deeply analyze their own biomechanics, which led to a profound, unified understanding of their own movements.
It's a great lesson.
It makes you wonder about your own desk, your own habits, your own routines. Think back to that metaphor of the shattered smartphone screen we started with.
Right.
What smooth rubbers do you have in your own life? What easy, perfectly reliable tools, apps, or routines are actually making you a lazier problem solver?
That's a great question to leave on.
Because if your tools never push back, if they never force you to fail and reflect, you really have to ask yourself, are they quietly preventing you from discovering a much more powerful way to swing?